In 1980, an Iraqi tank commander climbed into a vehicle his government had purchased from a country that had never sold a tank to anyone before. The gun was Chinese. The armor was Chinese. The optics were Chinese. 4 years later, an Iranian tank commander did the same thing, in a nearly identical vehicle, bought from the same manufacturer. The two men would eventually meet each other on the same battlefield, firing the same ammunition at each other, in machines built on the same production line. That manufacturer was Norinco. And that story, selling armor to both sides of the same war, without apology, without restriction, and without a second thought, is the thread that runs through every vehicle in this film. What follows is not just a catalog of machines. It is a record of how one nation, starting from a copied Soviet blueprint and nothing else, built its way across 7 decades into the most prolific and strategically consequential armored vehicle industry outside the United States and Russia. From the paddy fields of Vietnam to the deserts of Kuwait, from the Tibetan Plateau to the export halls of Karachi, Chinese armor went everywhere, and it changed everything it touched. Chapter 1: The Soviet Blueprint, the tanks that built the foundation. The story begins not with a Chinese engineer, but with a Soviet train. In the early 1950s, under technology sharing agreements that briefly bound Beijing and Moscow together, the blueprints for the T-54A medium tank arrived in China. The result, introduced into People's Liberation Army service in 1959, was the Type 59. China did not license it. China did not negotiate a royalty arrangement. China simply built it, and kept building it for 26 years. Between 1959 and 1985, China produced an estimated 9,500 to 10,000 Type 59S, the most numerically significant tank ever manufactured in Asia. The original variant weighed 36 tons, carried a 100mm rifled gun, and wore armor no thicker than the T-54A it copied. It did not need to be sophisticated. It needed to be cheap, reliable, and present in numbers no potential adversary could ignore. Pakistan was the first major customer, receiving several hundred from the mid-1960s onward, and deploying them against Indian Centurions during the 1965 and 1971 wars. The 100mm gun was just adequate. The armor was marginal. The price was right. That combination defined Norinco's export philosophy for the next half-century. Tanzania, Zambia, Sudan, Bangladesh, Congo, Zimbabwe, Albania, North Vietnam. The Type 59 spread across the developing world, filling inventory gaps for governments that needed armor and could not afford anything else. North Vietnam deployed several hundred in the final offensives of 1974 and 1975. On the 5th of June 1989, a column of Type 59 advanced down Chang'an Avenue in Beijing and produced what became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. The hull was never the limit. The Type 59I added a laser rangefinder in the late 1970s, improving first-round hit probability beyond 1,000 meters. The Type 59-2 replaced the original gun with a licensed copy of the British L7 105mm rifled gun, a NATO standard weapon on a Soviet-derived hull. That detail alone tells you everything about how pragmatically Chinese engineers approached every upgrade problem they faced. A country that had copied Moscow was now borrowing from London without anyone's permission. The Type 59D, developed in the early 1990s, added explosive reactive armor on the turret and glacis, a computerized stabilized fire control system, a 580 horsepower engine, and the 105mm Type 83 gun, a tank designed in the 1950s, made survivable against 1990s threats. The Type 59G went further, replacing the original cast turret entirely with a welded structure derived from the Type 96A, fitting a 125mm smoothbore gun and third-generation fire control. Bangladesh ordered approximately 300 conversions of its existing fleet rather than buying new vehicles. The math was simple. Why purchase a new tank when you can rebuild an old one to fight on equal terms? While the Type 59 went everywhere, China was solving a different problem at home. The mountainous terrain of the south, the rice paddies, the river crossings, none of it suited a 36-ton main battle tank. The Type 62, entering service in 1962, was the answer. 21 tons, armor maxing out at 35 millimeters, an 85 millimeter rifled gun, already a generation behind, but it could go where the Type 59 could not. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 exposed what that design cost. Vietnamese infantry with RPGs found its thin flanks without difficulty. Mali, Tanzania, Guinea, and Congo all received export batches. China produced approximately 1,393 Type 62s before production ended. The Type 62I added a laser rangefinder and infrared searchlight, but the fundamental vulnerability never went away. 1 year after the Type 62, a third first-generation machine appeared with a completely different purpose. The Type 63 amphibious light tank entered service in 1963, designed for one mission above all, crossing the Taiwan Strait. At 18.5 tons, propelled by rear-mounted hydrojets at 11.5 kilometers per hour through water, it carried the same 85 millimeter gun as the Type 62. It was not a tank hunter, it was a door opener, a vehicle meant to deliver fire support onto a beach before defenses could organize. North Korea received them. Thailand operated Type 63s alongside American M41 Walker Bulldogs and Chinese Type 69s, one of the most logistically complicated light armor fleets in Southeast Asia. Vietnam captured examples during the 1979 border conflict and reportedly used them in subsequent skirmishes through the early 1980s. The Type 63A, upgraded in the 1990s, replaced the 85 millimeter gun with a 105 millimeter rifled weapon, added a laser rangefinder, and improved the propulsion system. Changes significant enough that China treated it as an essentially new vehicle. Chapter 2. The Captured Blueprint, the T-62 Secret, and the Decade of Dead Ends. On the frozen Ussuri River in March 1969, Chinese and Soviet soldiers fought a border skirmish that both sides officially downplayed for decades. The Chinese came away with something more valuable than territory. A damaged Soviet T-62 had fallen through the ice, and engineers recovered it. Reverse engineering began immediately, and by 1969, work had started on the Type 69. The key innovation was a smoothbore 100 millimeter gun borrowed from the T-62. The problem was that Chinese industry could not manufacture smoothbore barrels to consistent tolerances. The Type 69I, fielded in limited numbers in the early 1970s, was quietly judged inferior to the Type 59 it was supposed to replace. That almost never gets said out loud about Chinese armor programs. The Type 69-2 saved it. Reversion to a rifled gun, a laser rangefinder, improved fire suppression, genuine first-generation targeting capability. Iraq purchased approximately 1,500 between 1982 and 1988. Iran purchased Chinese armor through separate channels during the same period. Both countries getting the same vehicle from the same factory. Neither cared, because Norinco was the only seller willing to supply both simultaneously. The Type 69-2 also went to Bangladesh, Burma, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Zimbabwe. Thailand purchased 50 Type 69 IIGs in 1988. A variant with a 730 horsepower engine and improved fire control, negotiated as a complete package with crew training, and Norinco supplied spare parts support. In 1991, Iraqi Type 69 IIs met American M1A1 Abrams tanks in Kuwait. Coalition records document kills at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, by 120mm fire that Iraqi crews could not return effectively. Iraq's after-action data went back to Norinco. Every destroyed hull in the desert was a design specification for the next program. The Type 79 was a transitional answer. A Type 69 hull, fitted with the 105mm L7 derived gun and a computerized fire control system. Only about 110 were built, all PLA retained, never exported. Not a product, a proof of concept. Few people know what came next. In March 1970, 1 year after Zhenbao Island, China launched the WZ-122 program, its first genuine attempt at a second-generation tank that owed nothing to Soviet blueprints. The ambition was remarkable. The WZ-122 was designed around a 120mm smoothbore gun, a caliber that, if the Chinese timeline is accurate, predated the German Keiler test vehicle, predecessor to the Leopard 2, by approximately 2 years. Two variants were built, the WZ-122A with hydropneumatic suspension and the WZ-122B with torsion bars. Testing from 1971 to 1973 covered nearly 3,000 kilometers and revealed persistent reliability failures that Chinese manufacturing could not solve. Cancelled around 1,974, consumed by the same political turmoil that had already dismantled a generation of Chinese research programs. Partially reinstated in 1977 under WZ-1224 and WZ-1226 sub-designations, feeding technical research that eventually informed the Type 80 and every Chinese tank family that followed. The WZ-122 never became a tank, but it became the reason the Type 99 exists. Without that failure, there would have been no institutional knowledge to build on, and no engineers who had already learned the expensive lessons. Chapter 3: The Second Generation. Pakistan, the autoloader, and the partnership that changed everything. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War changed how every serious military thought about armor, composite protection, guided missiles, electronic countermeasures. Tank crews who had survived the fighting described a battlefield where no amount of steel was enough if the fire control could not acquire and engage before the opponent did. China watched carefully. PLA analysis, informed also by the painful lessons of the 1979 border conflict with Vietnam, produced requirements the Type 59 and Type 69 families simply could not meet. The answer was the Type 80. The Type 80 was the first Chinese tank that did not directly copy a Soviet vehicle. New elongated hull, 105mm rifled gun. A fully computerized fire control system with laser rangefinder and ballistic computer, the first in any Chinese production tank. 38 tons, 60 kilometers per hour on road, never exported in significant numbers. It was meant to prove that Chinese engineers could do this entirely on their own. The Type 82 added a 1,000 horsepower engine. Then, the Type 88A and Type 88B entered PLA service in the late 1980s with modular composite armor inserts in the turret and hull front, China's first operational use of non-homogeneous protection. Approximately 300 were built before the Type 96 superseded them. Pakistan declined the Type 80. Islamabad wanted something capable of facing the T-72S the Indian Army was acquiring from Moscow. That demand launched the Type 85 program. The Type 85I introduced a welded turret, replacing every cast turret that had defined Chinese design until that point. The Type 85IA crossed a threshold that changed everything. A 125mm smoothbore gun, fed by an autoloader, same caliber as the T-72. No loader, 3 crew. China had closed in one step a firepower gap that had existed for 20 years. The Type 85 IIM was the dedicated Pakistani variant, built with heavy industries Taxila, incorporating Pakistani specified power plant options and modified fire controls. Pakistan assembled its version as the Al-Khalid prototype and presented it to the world as an indigenous design. Western defense reporting accepted that framing for years. The autoloader from the Type 85 IIM transferred directly into the Type 96 program, making Pakistan's export vehicle an inadvertently funded research testbed for China's next domestic generation. The Type 92, shown publicly in 1991, weighed 48 tons and ran on a Ukrainian 6TD 1200 horsepower diesel, the first Chinese tank program to use a foreign engine as its primary power source. Morocco evaluated it in competitive trials against Soviet-derived alternatives and Western options during the 1990s, but did not place a production order. Pakistan used it as the direct basis for the Al-Khalid MBT, which entered service in 2001 with a Ukrainian engine, a Chinese gun, and a Pakistani hull assembled at Heavy Industries Taxila. The arrangement was one of the most internationally composite tank programs of the post-Cold War era. The Type 90 IIM replaced the Ukrainian power plant with a domestic 1,200 horsepower WD-396 diesel, reducing a supply chain vulnerability that made some buyers nervous. Myanmar purchased a reported 160, integrating them into a ground force simultaneously receiving Chinese infantry equipment, artillery, and logistics support. Then there is the Al-Zarar, which almost nobody outside South Asian defense circles has heard of. Pakistan's Heavy Industries Taxila began it in 1990 with Chinese technical advisors, a comprehensive rebuild of the aging Type 59 fleet involving 54 individual modifications. At 42.5 tons, the Al-Zarar shared almost nothing beyond basic hull geometry with the Type 59 underneath. 125mm smoothbore gun, Ukrainian 730 horsepower engine, thermal sights, explosive reactive armor borrowed from the Al-Khalid program running concurrently at the same facility. Serial production began January 2003. Pakistan Army induction, February 2004. Approximately 320 units converted by 2012. It never found an export customer. It was a national solution, not a commercial product, and the market knew the difference. Chapter 4. The Domestic Giants. The tanks China built for itself and nobody else. The Type 96 entered PLA service in 1997, not an export vehicle stretched into domestic use. A deliberate, factory-optimized machine designed to replace the Type 59 and Type 69 across every frontline armored formation in China. 42.5 tons, 125mm smoothbore with autoloader, composite armor turret rated against contemporary anti-tank missile warheads. Total production has exceeded 2,500 vehicles, the most numerously produced third-generation tank in Chinese history. Unit cost approximately $1.5 million, 1/4 the price of a contemporary M1A2 Abrams. That gap is not incidental. That gap is the entire Norinco export argument. The Type 96A, introduced around 2005, was a different vehicle. Explosive reactive armor across turret and hull front. Hunter-killer fire control. The commander independently identifies and hands off targets to the gunner while simultaneously searching for the next threat. 1,000 horsepower engine. A tactical capability that had previously existed only in the Leopard 2A5 and M1A2 SEP. At the 2016 tank biathlon hosted by Russia, a Type 96B crew recorded the fastest individual lap time in the competition's history, demonstrating reliability and crew proficiency that Western analysts had not fully credited. Sudan purchased Type 96 variants, extending a ground force relationship with Norinco that already covered infantry weapons, artillery, and armored personnel carriers. While the Type 96 went to mass production, a separate program was developing on a different trajectory. The Type 98, internally WZ-123, known as Project 9910, appeared publicly on the 1st of October, 1999, at the National Day Parade in Beijing. Western analysts initially called it a production vehicle. It was not. Approximately 40 to 50 pre-production units, the engineering bridge between the export-oriented Type 92 and the machine China actually wanted. The Type 98 had a 1,200 horsepower diesel and, unusually, a manual loader, 4 crew. That choice reflected a genuine internal debate: Soviet-style autoloader versus Western-style human loader. The Type 98 was where China asked that question in operational conditions rather than a laboratory. The answer came in 2001 with the Type 99, 1,500 horsepower turbocharged diesel based on German MTU technology, produced under license. The increase from 1,200 to 1,500 horsepower gave the Type 99 a power-to-weight ratio competitive with the M1A2 Abrams autoloader, 3 crew, welded composite armor turret with a wedge-shaped explosive reactive armor package that drew visible inspiration from the angular front armor of the Leopard 2A5, and something with no Western production equivalent at the time: a laser, dazzler, and blinder system mounted coaxially, capable of detecting incoming laser rangefinder or guidance beams, and automatically slewing the gun toward the source. Not a passive defense, an active one. The Type 99A, introduced around 2011, added an active protection system, higher-grade ceramic armor inserts, improved thermal management, and a digitized battlefield management system linking individual vehicles to command networks. In 2015, the International Institute for Strategic Studies assessed it as broadly comparable to the Leopard 2A6 and the M1A2 SEP. The first time a Western analytical body had placed a Chinese tank in the global top tier, total Type 99 production estimated at 500 to 600 vehicles, never exported. China has no intention of changing that. Chapter 5. The Mountain and the Market. The ZTQ-15 and the VT Catalog. There is a specific problem with putting a 54-ton main battle tank in Tibet. The air is too thin for the engine to breathe properly. The roads cannot carry the weight. The Indian Army fields T-72 derivatives specifically configured for high-altitude operations along that border, and the PLA had nothing capable of meeting them on equal terms in that terrain. The ZTQ-15, officially the Type 15, upon entering PLA service in 2018, was the answer. 33 to 35 tons, operational above 4,000 meters where heavier vehicles cannot go. Its 105mm rifled gun was chosen specifically to reduce recoil on a lighter hull, while still providing penetration capability against T-72 armor at combat ranges. Third-generation fire control, stabilized thermal sights, laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, a small tank built for a serious threat in a place where no serious tank could operate. The development program reportedly cost under $500 million in total, one of the most cost-efficient third-generation development efforts in modern armor history. Norinco did not keep this one to itself. The VT-5, export designation of the ZTQ-15 family, went to Thailand in 2017. 38 vehicles at approximately $57 million, replacing aging Chinese Type 69S and American M41 Walker Bulldogs. Bangladesh ordered 44, third-generation capability, adaptable to jungle and highland terrain, at a price nobody else could approach. The VT-1A, export designation for the Type 96A, was priced at $1.5 to $1.8 million per unit. Positioned as a direct budget alternative to the Russian T-90S and Ukrainian T-84 inches every competitive tender it entered. Morocco placed a reported order for 150 vehicles, approximately $400 million, one of the largest single African armored vehicle contracts of that decade. The VT-4, introduced publicly at Defense Services Asia in 2014, was the flagship, 1,300 horsepower, 125mm auto-loaded gun, modular active protection as a standard option. Pakistan became the first confirmed customer. Deliveries from 2018 reported totals reaching 176 vehicles, adding a third distinct Chinese-origin tank type to a procurement relationship that had been running without interruption since 1964. Nigeria placed a reported order in the early 2020s. Thailand ordered 28 VT-4S in 2017 alongside its VT-5 contract, the only country simultaneously fielding both types, a logistics decision that reflected how thoroughly Norinco had positioned itself as Southeast Asia's default armor supplier. Priced at $2.5 to $3 million per unit, in direct competition with Russian T-90 milliseconds exports. The commercial advantage Norinco never needed to state out loud: no end-user restrictions, no resale limits, no Western government pressure on the buyer. The contract was the contract. The Iran-Iraq War was the largest sustained combat test of Chinese armor in history. 3,000 or more vehicles on both sides across 8 years of attritional fighting in the desert and marshland between two rivers. They performed adequately in infantry support roles. They were vulnerable to guided missiles, including French, Hot, and American Tau variants that both sides had acquired through entirely separate channels from entirely separate suppliers. Nobody asked Norinco how it felt about that. Norinco took the feedback and kept building. The Gulf War in 1991 was more conclusive. 300 to 400 Chinese-supplied vehicles destroyed in 100 hours of ground combat. M1A1 Abrams tanks recording kills on Type 69S at 3,500 meters, ranges at which the Iraqi crews had no hope of return fire. The performance gap was not marginal, it was absolute. PLA planners used that result as the primary justification for accelerating the Type 96 and Type 99 programs through the 1990s. Every destroyed hull in the Kuwaiti desert was, in a specific sense, a design specification for the next generation. Across 7 decades, China moved from a country that could only copy a design it had been given to one producing a vehicle Western analysts place alongside the Leopard 2A6. That arc has no equivalent in modern defense industry history outside the original Cold War superpowers. The commercial doctrine never changed. Undercut every Western competitor, transfer technology to serious customers, ask no questions about end use, and channel export revenue into the next domestic generation. The WZ-122 failed, and nobody outside China heard about it for 20 years. The Type 59G put a third-generation turret on a 60-year-old hull, and Bangladesh bought 300 of them. The Type 98 asked a question in pre-production steel, and the Type 99 answered it. The Al-Zarar rebuilt a tank that had no business still being in service, and gave it another 2 decades of operational relevance. Pakistan's Al-Khalid carried Chinese engineering into South Asian deterrence while officially wearing a Pakistani name. Every one of those choices, made under constraints no Western contractor has ever accepted, produced something that flew the Norinco flag into a conflict somewhere on Earth. The Type 99A sits in PLA formations that will never appear in an export catalog. The VT-4 is reaching customers the West cannot or will not supply. The ZTQ-15 is operating at altitudes where no competitor bothered to design a vehicle. The arsenal that started with a copied Soviet blueprint in a northeastern Chinese factory in 1959 now spans every weight class, every operational environment, and every price point a ground force commander anywhere on Earth might need. And it is still growing.